Hi, good morning to you. Colin and I did reminisce about how long we've known each other and both got terribly depressed, so we're going to try and cheer myself up for the next 10 minutes or so. This is a PowerPoint-free presentation, mostly because I didn't feel I had enough time to draw some up, actually, so you won't find my slides on the website from tomorrow, but anyone see me speak before, I always use the same one, so you'll find them somewhere, and you make some sort of relevance to this. When Colin first asked me to do this session some months ago, it was pre-election. So had I written anything down to say to you then, which I didn't actually, I would have ripped it up and started again. For us mere public servants, us mere government officials, this is a period of austerity. It's only because I'm coming to an external event can I drink your coffee and I can come here on the tube rather than walking, coming by bicycle or perhaps on a sedan chair, because this is where we are in the era of deficits and using what we do to reduce spend. And it's very interesting, sort of looking back, who would have thought, I guess, that the government was formed only 6 weeks ago. To some of us, it probably seems like 6 years, because an awful lot has happened in that 6 weeks. And it's interesting, and who would have thought that there would be a cabinet minister with a responsibility for procurement. And procurement, again, was coming very much back to the top of government's agenda. If for no other reason, government feels it spends too much, it's got a huge deficit, and it's made plans to save £6 billion this fiscal year, which we're already almost a quarter into. So procurement and commercial activity is back at the top of the agenda, as it was 25 years ago. Actually, it was when Colin and I first met, when the Central Unit on Purchasing, as it was called then, were to set up then, jointly between Treasury and Cabinet Office, to look at government's huge procurement expenditure. And the remit has moved into wider public sector since then. And here we are back on the top of the agenda, where the new government, with its drive for procurement, is looking at well-publicised ways of going about cutting that deficit, from renegotiating corporate contracts to collaboration across the public sector for procurement activities, to shared services for procurement, for contestability and outsourcing, which is the subject of today's session, and looking at total transparency in the way the public sector goes about its procurement business, which is an interesting journey that we've been on over the past 20-odd years. So procurement back at the top of the agenda, as we were back in 1985, as when Colin and I first met. We did look a lot younger then, so years have not been kind to either of us. DWP is indeed a large, it looks worse for him than me, I know you're thinking that. He's had a very hard life. DWP is a very large department, and maybe it won't be into the near future. But currently over 100,000 staff in 1,000 locations, with running costs of over £9.5 billion per year, administering pensions and benefits of around £140 billion a year. And you'll have seen quotes in the media over the weekend of how ministers look to use that as a way to tackle the deficit the country has. So back to DWP, it has a mission to touch every citizen in this country at some point of their lives. Indeed, our strapline is what we do and how we do it affects everyone in the UK at some point in their life, whether they're unemployed and on benefit and being assessed for benefit. There may well be some of you in the room who are like that today, I hope not. Or those of you who are approaching a pension age, like Colin and myself, will become customers of DWP at some time in the near future. With all that money that cycles through a large government department, we're probably more akin to a financial PLC than to a classic Whitehall department. And I'm sure you'll look at your own organisations and have similar sorts of views, that you port very comfortably into being a blue chip private sector organisation operating in a public sector domain. And just as a bit of info for me, hands up if you are in public sector, just so I know. Quite a lot. Thank you very much. Any consultants here? Not so busy as you were, probably, in public sector at least, but I'm sure much of that will change. Procurement, and indeed outsourcing, we'll come on to that moment, is still big business in government. It always was. It was 25 years ago, it is now. Whitehall spends about £20 billion a year on goods and services in procurement. And the wider public sector, in the UK public sector that many of you represent here, spends in excess of £200 billion per year on goods and services. And generally it's done well. Generally it's done efficiently. And generally the progress over the year has been good. For DWP, our procurement expenditure is about £4.5 billion per year. It's the largest spending Whitehall department and accounts for about 25 to 30% of Whitehall expenditure. As a percentage of overall public sector procurement expenditure, it's not large. But as Colin mentioned earlier, it does equate to a large private sector organisation in spend power and management of markets. And management of markets, particularly in an outsourcing context, is particularly important. And I know that colleagues will come on to that later. What we do in procurement and commercial activity in any form in the public sector is always high profile. It's always highly visible, which is a bit of code for when you get it right, nobody really notices. And if you get something wrong, it's usually in the press, but that's the type of environment that we live and work in. So procurement back on the top of government's agenda. And old thinking about what we do and how we approached outsourcing and how we approach contestability, where we used to be seen as perhaps a barrier to business, as a process, all about requisitions, just a bit of negotiation, where now it's about delivery and now it's about value. So in terms of the outsourcing contestability debate, which is not a new one, DWP has been cited, I don't know if this is a good or bad thing actually, as probably the most outsourced department in Whitehall. You may yourself be representing organisations that have had an outsourcing policy over the year and have applied that rigidly and commercially, and no doubt having good value delivered from that. But the challenges that the country faces, that the government face, probably means that we are compelled to look closely at the choices we have in deciding how, and one might say if, services are delivered within our own organisations. Our contestability, and I'll use contestability rather than outsourcing, because outsourcing probably is just one of the ways to deliver a contestability policy, explains the range of choices that we have and how we might select the most appropriate process for delivering the services that our organisation needs to deliver. Some of the typically outsourced services in the public sector, and I'll cite my own department, where all of these have been, I hope, successfully outsourced over the years: property and estate, ISIT, back office services, print and distribution, shared services, storage and retrieval, and getting even close to the core activity of our organisation. Indeed, one of the features over the years as we become more expert in outsourced type arrangements is that we've been letting less and less contractual mechanisms for goods, to the point that there may not be any at all, and more for services over a much wider range of products that we need, and indeed over much longer contracts. And I think if I look back over the past 25 years, when public sector procurement had its last kickstart, then who would have thought then that we would be letting 20-year contracts, as indeed many of us probably are letting 20-year contracts. DWP is now an asset-free organisation. Whether that's a good thing or not, it absolutely is. We own no assets either in estate or in technology. They are all outsourced, and we buy them back on a usage and service type basis. But 20-year contracts are an interesting dimension, because any of you were going back to your desk today and letting a 20-year contract, probably for me at least, the only thing I would know if that was me is I wouldn't be there when it started to go wrong, and I certainly probably wouldn't be there when it was coming to its close. That's quite an interesting place to be, because you're passing a legacy on to your current colleagues and those who will follow you. And it's quite a responsibility, that you're not only selecting the services to which to consider to be contested or outsourced, you're putting in place mechanisms that your successor and your successor's successor will be managing, and will get to a point where they need to be considered again, and looking whether your decision was valid, was ever valid, and indeed is still valid. And some of the many issues that you'll consider when making that contestability outsourcing decision, and I know and my fellow speakers here will address that, are many and varied. And certainly one of the flavours of the current year, month, probably the next 5 or 10 years, is when we make those outsourced decisions, how cognizant are we of the responsibilities, for example, around data that might be involved in those, and all other things that are pivotal around making that commercial decision.